Adrian Vale thought money could protect the people he loved, but it took the whisper of a foster child to reveal the betrayal happening right under his nose. Emily sat very still on the leather chair in the corner of the hospital waiting room, her small hands folded in her lap, her eyes scanning everything around her. At 8 years old, she had learned that silence made people forget she was there, and when people forgot she was there, they showed who they really were. She had only been living with Adrian Vale for 3 months, yet she already knew more about him than he probably realized. He was tall, with the kind of presence that made everyone stand straighter when he entered a room, his tailored suits whispering of wealth and power. To the outside world, he was the man who could buy anything, solve any problem with a call or a signature. But to Emily, he was still a stranger, someone who had signed papers to bring her into his house, but who had not yet found the time to really know her. The hospital had become their second home these past 2 weeks. Adrian's mother, Margaret Vale, lay in the ICU after surgery, fragile and pale against white sheets. Adrian visited her daily, bringing flowers, arranging for specialists, calling in favors from the best doctors in the country. He did it all with precision, his voice calm and his instructions firm, but Emily noticed that his eyes rarely softened. He loved his mother, she could tell, but he showed it in the same way he managed his business, through action, through control, through money. Emily had spent hours in the quiet hallways, waiting while adults spoke in hushed tones. She had learned to watch the nurses, to memorize the way their faces changed when certain people passed. She had seen the way Dr. Harding, the physician in charge, stiffened whenever Adrian's fiancée Victoria appeared. Victoria came every day in perfect heels, her smile dazzling, her perfume leaving a trail behind her. She fussed over Adrian, smoothing his tie, whispering encouragement, always staying close to his side. To most people, she seemed devoted, but Emily saw something else. Victoria's eyes never lingered on Margaret, never softened with worry for the woman in the bed. Instead, they darted to the charts, the machines, the doctor, calculating, measuring. One afternoon, while Adrian stepped outside to take a call, Emily stayed behind, coloring quietly at a low table near the nurse's station. She heard Victoria's voice, low and urgent, carrying just enough for her to catch. The words made her fingers still on the crayon. "You'll have what we discussed. Just make sure it's done. He can't know." Emily kept her head bent, pretending to shade in the corner of her picture, but her heart began to race. She risked a glance. Victoria was speaking to Dr. Harding, who nodded stiffly, his hand tightening around a clipboard. Most children might not have noticed, but Emily had lived through years of foster homes where whispered deals and secret looks meant everything. She knew the sound of a lie, the weight of a bribe, the chill of a secret meant to stay hidden. She pressed her lips together, her brown eyes wide but unreadable. Nobody looked at her. Nobody ever did. But Emily saw it all, and she knew something was wrong. She looked toward the ICU doors where Margaret lay sleeping, and then toward the hallway where Adrian paced on his phone. She hugged her sketchpad tightly to her chest. She didn't know when, she didn't know how, but she was certain she would have to tell him. Someone had to. The steady beeping of machines filled the ICU room, a sound that had become the background to every visit. Margaret Vale lay in the bed, her skin pale against the white sheets, her breathing shallow but steady. The doctors said the surgery had gone well, yet Adrian kept asking for second opinions, hiring more specialists, ordering every test possible. Money was not a question. Nothing was ever too expensive when it came to his mother's health, and yet his way of showing care looked more like a business transaction than a son sitting by his mother's side. He stood tall in his dark suit, speaking in low measured tones with the doctors, his eyes sharp as he questioned every detail. But when he looked at Margaret, his face never softened, as if tenderness was something he could not allow himself to show. Emily sat in the corner of the room, her legs swinging lightly against the chair as she watched. She had grown used to being invisible, and she knew Adrian barely noticed her presence during these hospital visits. That gave her freedom to look closely at things he overlooked. She saw the way Margaret's lips curved into a faint smile whenever Adrian entered, even if he only stood there with his hands in his pockets, even if his words were clipped and full of medical terms instead of comfort. Emily noticed how Margaret's hands sometimes twitched, reaching slightly toward him, but Adrian never seemed to see it, always too busy reviewing charts or taking calls from the specialists he had brought in. The nurses moved around the room with professional precision, but Emily caught the way they exchanged glances when Adrian barked another instruction or demanded a faster update. They were polite, careful, respectful because of who he was, but she could feel the tension in the air. It was the same kind of tension she had felt in foster homes when adults wore smiles that never reached their eyes. She understood the language of unease better than most, and she saw it here in the way the staff held themselves stiffly, in the way Dr. Harding cleared his throat before answering Adrian's questions, in the way the younger nurses kept their eyes lowered. Adrian thought he was protecting his mother by relying on the best money could buy, but Emily could see that Margaret longed for something far simpler. When Adrian finally sat in the chair by her bed, Margaret's eyes followed him with a gentleness that made Emily ache. She whispered his name once, her voice weak but warm, and for a moment Adrian paused, caught between his world of control and the reality of his mother's fragile state. Then the phone in his pocket vibrated, and just like that his attention slipped away again. Emily hugged her sketchpad tightly against her chest, her brown eyes never leaving Margaret's face. She saw the love in the older woman's faint smile. She saw the loneliness that hid beneath it, and she understood something Adrian did not. Sometimes care was not about money or the best doctors. Sometimes it was simply about holding a hand and letting someone know they were not alone. Victoria arrived at the hospital each day as if she were walking into a gala, her heels clicking softly against the polished floors, her perfume drifting ahead of her like an announcement. She always carried fresh flowers, sometimes roses, sometimes lilies, always arranged by the best florist in the city. Nurses noticed her right away, their eyes following the tall woman with glossy hair and a smile that never faltered. Adrian seemed to draw strength from her presence, as if her confidence filled in the spaces where his own began to crack. He leaned on her more than he realized, letting her handle the small things that he told himself did not matter, but that Emily knew mattered most. Whenever bills arrived, Victoria was the first to take them, her manicured hands smoothing the pages flat as she told Adrian she would make sure everything was in order. When doctors came in with updates, she guided the conversation, asking questions in a voice that carried just enough authority to suggest she belonged at the center of decisions. Adrian nodded along, grateful that she was there, his trust evident in the way he allowed her to speak for him. Emily, from her usual seat near the window or the corner, saw it differently. She noticed how Victoria's eyes sharpened when she looked at charts, how she leaned in closer to the doctors when Adrian stepped out to take a call, how her smile widened just a little too much whenever Adrian praised her for being thoughtful. Margaret watched her too, though more quietly. Her gaze sometimes lingered on Victoria, with the weariness of a woman who had lived long enough to know the difference between devotion and performance. Emily caught it, the faint frown that flickered across Margaret's face before she forced herself to smile. Adrian never noticed. He was too wrapped up in gratitude that someone stood beside him during the long days and sleepless nights. One evening, as the sun set and the hospital lights hummed on, Emily saw Victoria whispering with Dr. Harding just outside the ICU room. She could not hear every word, but she saw the way Victoria's hand rested lightly on the doctor's arm, her smile practiced, her voice low. Adrian came back just in time to see Victoria pat the doctor's shoulder warmly and thank him for his care. Adrian thought it was kindness. Emily saw calculation. Victoria never missed a chance to touch Adrian's hand, to remind him she was there, to place herself between him and the questions he should have been asking. She presented herself as the perfect partner, calm in crisis, beautiful in every moment, reliable when he faltered. But Emily had learned long ago that people who work so hard to look perfect usually had something to hide. She watched in silence, her wide brown eyes taking in every detail, knowing one day she might need to speak, and knowing that when she did, it could change everything. The hospital was quieter at night, the constant shuffle of visitors and the chatter of nurses fading into a low hum. The hallways glowed with dimmed lights, casting long shadows on the tiled floor. Emily sat curled in a chair near the waiting area, her sketchpad balanced on her knees, though she had stopped drawing long ago. Adrian had gone to make a late phone call, his voice steady and businesslike even in the early hours, while Margaret slept in her ICU room surrounded by blinking machines. Emily should have been dozing too, but something about the stillness kept her awake. It was then she heard the faint echo of voices drifting down the corridor. She pressed her crayon gently against the paper and tilted her head, straining to catch the words. Victoria's voice was unmistakable, smooth and deliberate, carrying the same careful tone she always used when speaking to Adrian. But here, away from his presence, there was an edge to it, sharper and more urgent. "You'll have your compensation," Victoria whispered, the word clear enough to make Emily's heart beat faster. "But it has to be done quickly. We can't afford delays. Expedite the process." Emily's fingers stilled. She didn't understand everything, but she knew the shape of that conversation. In the foster homes she had lived in before, she had heard people whisper behind doors, exchanging promises and money, always in hushed tones, always with words that meant something wasn't right. Compensation. Expedite. She didn't know what they meant exactly, but she recognized the way they were spoken, like secrets meant to stay hidden. She slid quietly off her chair, careful not to make a sound, and inched closer to the corner of the hallway. Her small frame kept her hidden in the shadows as she peeked around. Victoria stood close to Dr. Harding, her perfect hair falling like a curtain over one shoulder, her smile faint but her eyes hard. She leaned in toward him, her hand brushing his sleeve in a way that looked casual but felt purposeful. The doctor shifted uncomfortably, his posture stiff, his voice low as he answered. Emily could not hear all of his words, only fragments that floated back. "Not standard protocol. Too risky, he'll notice. It not exegesis. Could leave this inverse sense." Victoria's response was sharper, almost cold. "He won't. He trusts me. Just make sure it's done." Emily held her breath, her chest tight, her eyes wide as she watched the exchange. She didn't know what exactly was being arranged, but she felt the weight of it pressing on her small shoulders. She had learned to tell the difference between kindness and control, between comfort and manipulation, and she knew this was the latter. When Adrian's footsteps echoed from the far end of the corridor, Victoria straightened instantly, her face shifting back into the soft smile she always wore around him. The doctor excused himself quickly, his voice polite but strained, and Victoria turned to greet Adrian with a look of concern and devotion. To anyone else, it would seem like nothing more than a woman caring for the man she loved. But Emily saw it differently. She saw the quick change in Victoria's expression, the hidden urgency still burning in her eyes, the way she placed herself at Adrian's side as though nothing unusual had just happened. Emily hugged her sketchpad against her chest, her mind racing. She could not explain what she had heard, but she knew, as surely as she knew the sound of her own heartbeat, that something was very wrong. Emily sat in the back seat of the car on the way home from the hospital, her fingers tracing patterns on the window fogged by her breath. The city lights blurred past, but she hardly noticed them. Her mind was still stuck on the words she had overheard the night before, words she didn't fully understand, but that carried the same chill she had felt in houses where secrets turned into shouting matches and doors slammed hard enough to rattle the glass. Compensation. Expedite. She repeated them silently, trying to put meaning to them, trying to decide if she should tell Adrian what she had heard. He sat in the front, his phone pressed to his ear, his voice clipped as he spoke about markets and investors. Even at this late hour he was working, his mind moving faster than anyone else's, always a step ahead when it came to money. But Emily wondered if he was steps behind when it came to people. She clutched her sketchpad to her chest, her courage building in her small body, until she finally whispered, "Adrian, something feels wrong." At first he didn't hear her, or maybe he thought he hadn't. He finished his call, slipped the phone into his pocket, and turned slightly toward her. "What's that, Emily?" His tone was patient but distracted. The same tone he used with nannies and assistants who interrupted him while he was deep in thought. She bit her lip, unsure how to make him listen. But then she said more firmly, "Victoria talked to the doctor. She gave him something. She said words like compensation and expedite." It didn't sound right. Her voice wavered, but her eyes stayed steady on his face. Adrian blinked, surprised, then gave a soft laugh, shaking his head as if easing away a child's fear of the dark. "Emily, you must have misunderstood. Victoria's been handling details for me. She's been under a lot of stress too. She probably just wanted the doctor to move things along for your grandmother's recovery. She cares about all of us." Emily's chest tightened. She had expected doubt, maybe even anger, but not the gentle dismissal. "I didn't misunderstand," she whispered. "I know what I heard." But Adrian only reached across the seat to pat her hand lightly, a gesture that felt more like a closing of the conversation than an opening. "I appreciate your concern, sweetheart. But sometimes adults talk about things that sound strange to kids. You don't need to worry. Victoria has been nothing but loyal to me and my family." His voice softened, but his eyes had already turned back toward the road, toward the long list of responsibilities waiting for him. Emily leaned back against the seat, her small body folding into the silence. She was used to this. In other homes, she had tried to warn about things she saw, about pills missing, money changing hands, tempers boiling, but adults never believed her. They always thought she was imagining too much, or that her eyes were too young to understand. She stared out the window, her reflection faint in the glass, and clenched her hands around her sketchpad. If Adrian wouldn't believe her now, she would have to find another way. She would watch harder, listen closer, collect what she needed, until even he couldn't ignore it. She was small, and she was quiet, but she knew how to see the truth when no one else did. And she would not stop. Not this time. Not when Margaret's life might depend on it. The morning light barely reached the hospital windows, filtered through heavy blinds that left the ICU in its usual half-shadow. Emily sat quietly in her chair by the wall, her sketchpad open but untouched, her brown eyes fixed on the steady rhythm of the machines surrounding Margaret's bed. Something felt different today, though she could not explain why. Margaret's breathing was shallower, her lips tinged with a gray pallor that had not been there the night before. Emily pressed her small hands together and waited for Adrian to notice. But when he did, his response was to stand taller, his voice brisk as he called for the doctor. Dr. Harding entered with his clipboard, his face set in a mask of practiced calm. He explained that complications after surgery were not uncommon, that they were monitoring her closely, that adjustments were being made to stabilize her condition. Adrian, leaning heavily on the edge of the bed, demanded to know if more tests were required, if another specialist should be brought in, his tone sharp with urgency. The doctor assured him everything was under control, his words steady, his expression unreadable, and for the moment, Adrian seemed willing to believe him. Emily was not convinced. She had lived too many years reading faces to know when adults were hiding something. The doctor's eyes did not match his words. They flickered too quickly toward the machines, too quickly away from Adrian's stare. And then came the nurse. She moved quietly, almost invisible, carrying a small vial with a label Emily had never seen before. She placed it carefully on the counter, drew its contents into a syringe, and slipped it into the IV line, feeding into Margaret's arm. Emily leaned forward in her chair, her breath caught in her throat. She had watched the nurses give medicine before, had seen the bottles and vials lined neatly in their trays, But this one was different. The label was pale blue, printed with sharp black letters she could not pronounce, though her sharp eyes traced every letter, memorizing them one by one. She repeated the word silently in her head, holding it as tightly as a secret, her small fingers gripping the edge of her sketchpad. Margaret stirred weakly, her lips parting as if she wanted to speak, but the sound that came was only a faint sigh. Adrian took her hand, for once letting his composure falter, but his gaze remained fixed on the monitors, on the doctor's reassurances, on the world of answers that could be bought with money. He did not notice the vial. He did not notice the way the nurse kept her eyes low as she slipped away. Emily's heart pounded. She wanted to speak, to tug at Adrian's sleeve and tell him what she had seen, but the memory of him brushing her off the night before pressed against her chest. Adults never believed her at first. Still, she would not forget the name on that label. She whispered it to herself, over and over, sealing it inside her mind. Something was wrong here, and if no one else saw it, she would carry the truth until she could make Adrian see it for himself. Adrian adjusted his cufflinks as he stood near the ICU bed, his phone buzzing with reminders of the meeting he had to attend across town. He had already spent the morning pacing the hospital halls, speaking with doctors, signing forms, giving instructions to his assistants, but now duty was pulling him away. Margaret lay in the bed with her eyes closed, the machines surrounding her whispering their steady rhythm, her body weak but still fighting. Adrian leaned down, kissed her forehead gently, and promised he would return soon. His voice was steady, but Emily could see the strain in his jaw, the way his hand lingered on the railing a moment longer than usual. Emily sat quietly in the chair near the window, her sketchpad balanced on her knees, her small body tense with the weight of the secret she had been carrying. She had told herself all night that she would speak to him, that she could not keep silent any longer, not when Margaret's life might depend on it. Yet every time she looked at him she felt that same hesitation, the fear of being brushed aside, of hearing again that she had misunderstood, that she was just a child who didn't know what she had seen. But the words from the hallway still echoed in her ears. The image of the strange vial burned into her mind, and she knew she could not stay quiet. Adrian slipped his phone into his jacket pocket and turned toward the door. Emily's heart raced. If she let him leave now, she might lose her chance. And then what if something worse happened to Margaret before he came back? She slid off her chair, her shoes barely making a sound on the floor, and hurried to his side. She reached out and tugged on his sleeve, gentle at first, then firmer when he did not stop. "Just a second, Emily," he said, distracted, his eyes still on the door. But Emily would not wait this time. She tugged again, then leaned closer, rising on tiptoe so only he could hear. Her voice was small but certain, carrying the weight of everything she had seen and remembered. She bribed the doctor. The words froze him. He stopped moving, as if the air had turned solid around him. Slowly he looked down at her, his dark eyes searching her face, trying to decide if he had heard correctly. "What did you say?" His voice was low, cautious, almost unbelieving. Emily swallowed hard but did not look away. "Victoria bribed the doctor. I heard her. She said she would give him compensation, and to expedite. And yesterday the nurse gave your mother medicine that wasn't the same as before." I remembered the name. She hugged her sketchpad tightly, her voice trembling but strong. For the first time, Adrian really looked at her, not as a quiet child who kept to the edges of the room, but as someone carrying knowledge he did not have. The room seemed to hold its breath with him, the monitors beeping steadily, Margaret's frail form lying between them. Adrian's heartbeat thundered in his ears, his mind racing, pieces of memory and suspicion clicking into place. Emily stood very still, waiting for him to tell her she was wrong, waiting for him to brush it aside again. But this time, he said nothing. His silence was heavier than words, and in it Emily felt the first fragile thread of belief. Adrian stood frozen in the middle of the ICU room, Emily's whisper still hanging in the air between them. His first instinct was to dismiss it, to chalk it up to a child's imagination. The kind of misunderstanding that came from overhearing adult words she could not possibly grasp. He had investors waiting on him, a mother fighting for her life, a company that needed him steady, not distracted by a little girl's fears. But when he looked down at Emily, he saw no trace of fantasy in her face. Her brown eyes, wide and steady, carried none of the playful exaggeration he had come to expect from children. Instead, they burned with a certainty that unsettled him. He knelt slightly, bringing himself closer to her level, his voice low and sharp. "Tell me exactly what you saw." Emily clutched her sketchpad to her chest, her small hands tightening around it, but she did not falter. "I heard Victoria talking to Dr. Harding. She said he would get compensation, and that he should expedite something. She gave him something, like an envelope. And yesterday the nurse gave your mother medicine that was different. The label wasn't like the others. I remembered the name." Her words came slowly, carefully, each one chosen with the seriousness of someone who knew the danger of being dismissed. Adrian stared at her, torn between disbelief and a growing unease. His fiancée had been nothing but supportive, at least to his eyes, and he could not imagine her involved in anything that would harm his mother. Yet the clarity in Emily's voice left no room for the flighty guesses of a child. He searched her expression for hesitation, for signs that she was guessing, but found only the calm determination of someone who had seen too much in her short life. "You're telling me Victoria bribed the doctor?" Adrian's voice cracked slightly on the words, the idea almost impossible to speak aloud. Emily nodded once, her gaze steady. "Yes, I heard her. And the medicine yesterday was not the same. I know it." His chest tightened as he straightened, pacing a few steps before turning back to her. He wanted to believe Victoria, the woman who had stood beside him through the long hospital nights, who had whispered reassurance when his mother's health faltered. He wanted to believe she was the loyal partner he had convinced himself he needed. But Emily's words gnawed at him, dragging back memories of little details he had brushed aside. Victoria's habit of pulling doctors aside when she thought he was too busy to notice, her insistence on managing the bills, the way she always seemed to know too much about schedules before he told her. Adrian forced himself to meet Emily's eyes again. For the first time since she had come into his home, he listened without trying to explain away her fears. "Say the name of the medicine," he demanded. She spoke it carefully, each syllable crisp, the word etched into her memory. Adrian's blood ran cold. He recognized it at once. A powerful drug not meant for his mother's condition, one that could easily worsen her fragile state. The room seemed to tilt as realization pressed down on him. He felt the fracture of trust begin inside his chest, sharp and undeniable, and knew nothing could go back to the way it had been. Emily slid her sketchpad onto the side table, her small hands trembling slightly as she flipped through pages of half-finished drawings. Adrian watched, impatient but uneasy, his pulse quickening in a way he was not used to. He was a man who thrived on control, who calculated risks with the precision of a surgeon. But in this moment, he felt the edges of his world tilting. Emily stopped on a page that looked like a jumble of numbers and letters, but she tapped the center firmly, her voice quiet but unwavering. "This is the name. I wrote it down yesterday so I wouldn't forget." Adrian leaned closer, his eyes scanning the clumsy but careful handwriting. The drug's name leapt out at him, cold and clinical, and instantly recognizable. He had read about it once during a late-night review of pharmaceuticals, a medication used in rare cases but never for someone recovering from his mother's surgery. His throat tightened as he straightened, pulling his phone from his pocket with practiced speed. Emily stood silently at his side, her brown eyes watching him with both fear and certainty. He called one of his contacts, a former colleague who now worked as a senior consultant for one of the most respected medical boards in the country. His voice was clipped, stripped of any softness. He read the name aloud, his tone demanding, "Is this medication ever used for post-operative cardiac patients?" The pause that followed was short, but it carried the weight of a storm. His contact answered quickly, his voice firm. "No, absolutely not. That drug is contraindicated for cardiac recovery. It could worsen her condition. Who prescribed it? Adrian's stomach dropped. He thanked the man, promised to call again soon, then hung up, his hand tightening around the phone until his knuckles whitened. He looked down at Emily, who had not moved, who seemed almost too still for a child her age. "You're sure you saw this?" he asked, though the answer was already clear in her eyes. "I saw the nurse take it from a vial," she whispered. "And I remembered the letters. I knew it was important." Adrian pressed a hand against his forehead, pacing across the small space between the bed and the door. His mother's shallow breaths filled the silence, a fragile reminder of how close she stood to the edge. The alarms in his mind grew louder, sharper, pulling him away from denial. He thought of Victoria's late-night whispers, of the envelope, of the way she always took control of conversations with the staff. He thought of how much he wanted to believe in her, how much easier it was to accept her devotion at face value. But now the evidence was in front of him. Not imagined, not exaggerated, but written in the shaky handwriting of an 8-year-old girl who had noticed what he had missed. He turned back to Emily, his voice quieter now, heavy with something he had not allowed himself to feel until this moment. "You may have just saved her life." Emily hugged her sketchpad to her chest, her small shoulders stiff with the weight of the secret she had carried. She didn't smile. She only nodded, as if she knew the truth was still only beginning to unravel. Adrian stood over his mother's bed, alarm bells ringing louder than the machines, realizing he was no longer sure who in this hospital he could trust. Adrian found Victoria in the hospital lounge, her legs crossed neatly, a silk scarf draped around her shoulders, as if she had stepped out of a magazine instead of waiting outside an ICU. She smiled when she saw him, her eyes lighting up with the ease of someone who had always relied on beauty to soften the hardest moments. "How's your mother?" she asked, her tone full of concern, though her gaze flickered quickly over his face as if searching for the right response to give. He sat opposite her, his movements deliberate, his expression carefully guarded. He had built his empire by reading people, by knowing when they were lying or when they were bluffing, but he had never turned that skill on the woman he loved. Tonight he forced himself to. "I spoke with Dr. Harding," he said, his voice calm, almost casual, "and I heard something about compensation, something about expediting her treatment." Victoria's smile did not falter, but there was a brief flash in her eyes, a sharpness before she smoothed it over with practiced grace. She leaned forward slightly, her hand brushing against his arm. "Darling, you've misunderstood. I only spoke to him about making sure your mother received the best care. Money wasn't the issue. I just wanted him to know that nothing was too much for you, that whatever treatment she needed, you could provide it." Her words flowed easily, like silk. But Adrian noticed the way her fingers curled against her scarf, the faint tension at the edge of her mouth. He leaned back, folding his arms, his gaze steady. "Emily overheard you," he said softly. "She heard you promise him compensation. That's not about care, Victoria. That's something else." At the mention of Emily's name, Victoria's face shifted ever so slightly, irritation flashing before she caught herself. She laughed lightly, though the sound rang false. "Sweetheart, she's a child. Children hear what they want to hear. You've seen how she is, always quiet, always watching. I think she has an imagination that runs away with her." Adrian felt a heaviness settle in his chest. Emily's words had been clear, her eyes unwavering. He remembered the name of the drug she had copied, a drug that should never have been near his mother, and the unease grew sharper. He pressed further. "And what about the nurse yesterday? New medication, unapproved, slipped in without explanation. Did you ask for that too?" Victoria's expression faltered, the mask cracking for just a moment. She recovered quickly, placing her hand dramatically against her chest. "Of course not. Why would I ever do something like that? Adrian, you know me. I only want your mother to recover. I've done everything I can to support you." But her denial came too quickly, too perfectly rehearsed, and Adrian felt the fracture widen between them. Emily stood just outside the lounge door, her small body still, her eyes sharp and watchful. She said nothing, but in her silence there was certainty. She did not need to argue. She already knew the truth. Emily had grown used to the way adults brushed her off, but this time she refused to let it happen. After hearing Victoria's smooth explanations, she felt a fire inside her chest that would not go out. She knew what she had seen. She knew what she had heard. And she would not stop until Adrian knew too. That night, as the hospital settled into a hushed quiet, she tugged on his sleeve, her brown eyes fierce and steady. "You need to look at the cameras," she whispered. "The hospital has them everywhere. If you don't believe me, the cameras will show you." Adrian exhaled, running a hand through his hair. He was tired, pulled between the fear of losing his mother and the confusion of mistrust that had begun to creep in. "Emily," he said gently, "those cameras are for security, not for us. We can't just—" She shook her head before he could finish. "Yes, we can. You can do anything, you're Adrian Vale. And if you don't, then we'll never know the truth." Her voice did not waver, though her hands trembled slightly as she gripped her sketchpad. Adrian hesitated, torn between reason and the small, determined figure in front of him. He had been told by board members, lawyers, and rivals that he was a man who bent the world to his will, yet here was a child telling him what had to be done. Something in her gaze reminded him of himself when he was much younger, unwilling to let go until he had proof. Slowly, he nodded. "All right, we'll look." Getting access was not simple, but Adrian had built an empire on knowing how to open doors others thought locked. With a quiet phone call and a discreet favor from the head of hospital security, they found themselves in a small control room filled with glowing screens. The guard on duty had been dismissed with an order Adrian gave smoothly, leaving only him, Emily, and the rows of monitors. Emily climbed onto the chair beside him, her small face illuminated by the flickering screens. Together they scrolled back through the footage from the night she had overheard the whispers. At first it was nothing but doctors and nurses moving through the halls, the steady rhythm of a hospital in motion. Then Emily leaned forward sharply, pointing at the screen. "There," she said. The image showed Victoria, elegant as always, her movements calm and deliberate. She stood close to Dr. Harding, her posture angled just enough to block easy sight from the hallway. But the camera above caught everything. Adrian watched as she slid a slim envelope from her bag and passed it into the doctor's waiting hand. The exchange lasted only seconds, but it was undeniable. Adrian's breath caught, his chest tightening as the truth unspooled in front of him. He had wanted to believe her words, had wanted to cling to the comfort of loyalty and love, but the image on the screen left no room for doubt. Emily sat very still, her hands folded, her face calm in the way of someone who had expected this outcome all along. "You see," she whispered softly, not with triumph, but with the quiet sadness of being right when she had hoped to be wrong. Adrian closed his eyes for a moment, the fracture inside him now a chasm. The evidence was undeniable, and he knew his world would never be the same. The first sound was the long, flat tone of a monitor that broke the steady rhythm in the ICU. Adrian's head jerked up from the chair where he had been sitting, his phone forgotten on the table. Margaret's body, already pale and fragile, convulsed once before, her chest seemed to stop moving altogether. The machines erupted into chaos, alarms screaming, lights flashing, the soft hum of the room swallowed by panic. Nurses poured through the door within seconds, their voices sharp and clipped, calling out instructions as they moved with a speed that only came from training and fear. Adrian froze, his heart slamming in his chest. The sight of his mother collapsing into stillness cutting deeper than anything he had ever felt in boardrooms or financial wars. For all his control, for all his power, he was helpless here, standing at the edge of the room while others tried to save her. He pressed a hand to the railing, his knuckles white, his legs unsteady. Emily stood in the corner, her small frame stiff, her wide eyes fixed on Margaret, as the chaos swirled around her. She hugged her sketchpad to her chest, her breath shallow, but she did not look away. Fib, get the crash cart," one nurse shouted, already pressing pads against Margaret's chest. Another prepared injections, her hands shaking as she drew the liquid. Adrian stepped forward, his voice breaking. "What's happening? Tell me what's happening." The doctor answered quickly, his tone clipped. "She's crashing. We need to stabilize her now." "Stay back, sir." Adrian stumbled backward, the words slamming into him. The alarms echoed inside his skull, drowning out thought. All he could see was the thin body on the bed, his mother's chest rising only when forced by the oxygen mask. He wanted to scream, to fight, to demand she come back, but his voice caught in his throat. Emily moved closer to him, tugging at his sleeve with trembling fingers. Her voice was barely a whisper, but it cut through the noise like a blade. "This is because of the medicine. I told you." Adrian turned, staring at her, the chaos blurring around them. Her face was pale, but her eyes were steady, carrying the terrible truth he had tried so hard not to believe. And in that moment he understood. Without her persistence, without her sharp gaze and whispered warnings, he might never have noticed. She might have died without anyone realizing why. The defibrillator pads pressed against Margaret's chest. Her body jolted, lifted, then fell back against the bed. The beeping of the monitor hesitated, then returned in uneven bursts. The nurses shouted numbers, checked her pulse, adjusted lines. Slowly the flat tone faded, replaced by a fragile rhythm that filled the room with relief. Margaret was alive, but only just. Adrian's knees nearly buckled, and he pressed a hand over his mouth, his breath shaking. He turned to Emily, who still clung to him with fierce determination. He pulled her close, for once not seeing her as a child who needed to be protected, but as the reason his mother still breathed. In the aftermath of the storm, as the nurses worked to stabilize Margaret and reset the machines, Adrian realized the truth he could no longer ignore. Emily had saved his mother's life. Not his wealth, not his power, not his fiancé's soothing voice. A child's whisper, sharp and fearless, had been the only thing standing between his family and the silence of loss. Adrian had built his life on facts, on information gathered and measured until no question remained. After the chaos in the ICU, after watching his mother's body jolt back to life, he no longer had the luxury of denial. He spent the next day chasing answers, calling in favors, reaching into the network of contacts that had helped him climb from a hungry graduate with nothing to a man whose name carried weight in every boardroom. What he uncovered chilled him more than the machines that had screamed beside his mother's bed. It began with the medication. The drug Emily had memorized, the one never meant for his mother, was not only dangerous but traceable. A friend at the FDA confirmed that a batch had been purchased by a small private clinic, then redistributed under unusual circumstances. The clinic, when pressed, admitted the order had been arranged by Dr. Harding himself, bypassing the hospital pharmacy. That alone was enough to raise alarms. But Adrian pushed harder. He wanted names. He wanted to know who benefited. Within hours, he had them. A shell company, tied to Apex Holdings, a rival investment firm that had circled him for years, like vultures waiting for a stumble. He recognized the name of the man behind it, Vincent Marlowe, a competitor who had always admired Adrian's empire while quietly plotting its collapse. Adrian's jaw clenched as the truth became clearer. This was not just greed. This was strategy. Victoria's role became undeniable when one of his private investigators traced wire transfers from an offshore account to her personal bank. Large sums hidden well, but not well enough for Adrian's resources. The same day the money appeared, Dr. Harding received his own deposits through another channel connected to Marlowe's web of companies. The pattern was unmistakable. Victoria had been planted in his life, polished and perfect, sliding into his trust with devastating ease. The doctor had been her accomplice, his access to Margaret's treatment making the plan possible. The aim was cruel but brilliant: If Margaret died, Adrian would be consumed by grief and guilt. His focus would falter, his decisions clouded, his company vulnerable. With his attention pulled away, Apex could maneuver into position, forcing a takeover while his guard was down. If that failed, the scandal alone, whispers of negligence in his own family's care, would be enough to shake his investors' faith. Adrian sat in his office late that night, the hospital monitor still glowing on his phone screen beside him. Emily slept on the couch, curled up with her sketchpad clutched in her arms, her presence a reminder of the only person who had seen the truth before him. He looked at her, then at the pile of evidence on his desk, and felt the fracture inside him harden into resolve. They had tried to use his love as a weapon. They had thought his mother's life was just another move in their game, but they had not counted on the quiet eyes of a child who noticed everything. Adrian vowed then that neither Victoria nor Marlowe would see him broken. They had opened a war, and he intended to end it. The hospital lights flickered dimly as night settled in, leaving the corridors quieter than usual, the steady hum of machines the only sound that broke the silence. Adrian sat hunched at a small table in the corner of the private family room, his head resting against his hand, papers and reports scattered in front of him. His mother was still weak but stable, and for the first time in days he allowed himself to breathe. Yet peace refused to come. The betrayal pressed heavily against his chest, the weight of knowing Victoria's lies and Dr. Harding's corruption too much to ignore. Emily appeared in the doorway, her small frame almost swallowed by the oversized sweatshirt she wore. She held her sketchpad against her chest the way she always did, but tonight something else was tucked under her arm, a slim tablet with a cracked corner. She crossed the room quietly, the way she always moved, but there was determination in her steps. "I have something you need to see," she said softly, her voice steady despite her size. Adrian looked up, expecting perhaps another drawing or a list of observations she had memorized. But when she set the tablet on the table and powered it on, he realized this was more than a child's attempt to help. She tapped the screen quickly, navigating with surprising confidence through folders labeled with dates and times. "I started keeping track weeks ago," she explained, her tone calm but filled with the careful weight of someone who had been preparing for this moment. "At first it was just little things, like when Victoria asked me questions about you, or when she came here at odd hours. Then I started recording." He leaned closer, his eyes widening as she opened a file. The sound of Victoria's voice filled the room, clear and undeniable, whispering to Dr. Harding about compensation and urgency. Adrian felt his throat tighten as the words repeated, not imagined, not twisted by memory, but captured exactly as they had been. Emily flipped to another file, showing a photo she had snapped of the nurse holding the unfamiliar vial. The label was blurred but still readable, the same name she had written for him earlier. "You kept all this?" Adrian asked, his voice low with disbelief. Emily nodded. "I knew you wouldn't believe me at first. Adults never do. So I saved everything. Times, dates, even when she called people outside in the parking lot. I wrote down the license plate numbers too." She showed him her notes, each page neatly marked, her handwriting uneven but clear. Adrian sat back, staring at the screen, the evidence stacking up with each swipe of her small fingers. This was not the guesswork of a child. This was a record, detailed and undeniable, the kind of documentation that could unravel everything Victoria and Harding had built against him. He felt a rush of something sharp and humbling, a mix of pride and regret. Pride that Emily had the courage and foresight to protect him. Regret that he had doubted her for so long. He reached across the table, covering her small hand with his larger one. "Emily," he said quietly, his voice breaking for the first time in years, "you've done more than save my mother. You've saved me too." She met his gaze without flinching, her brown eyes steady. "I just wanted you to listen." And now, with proof in hand, Adrian knew he had no choice but to act. The morning began with a quiet tension that clung to every corner of the hospital. Adrian had spent the night reviewing Emily's files again and again, listening to Victoria's voice whisper about compensation, studying the photos of the vial, reading the careful notes written in a child's hand. By dawn, the decision was made. He called in contacts from the state medical board, men and women who owed him favors or respected the power of his name, and within hours the hospital corridors filled with a different kind of authority. Plainclothes investigators moved with purpose, their expressions grim, their folders thick with the evidence Emily had collected. Dr. Harding was the first to be confronted. He had just finished his morning rounds, his clipboard clutched against his chest, when two officials approached him with quiet but firm voices. They guided him into a conference room while Adrian stood at the end of the hall, watching with cold eyes. Emily remained at his side, small and steady, her fingers clutching her tablet, as if to remind him that this was the reason they had come this far. Through the open door, Adrian heard the officials reciting charges, presenting the recordings, reading out bank transactions that linked Harding directly to Apex Holdings. The doctor's face drained of color, his once smooth voice breaking into stammers as he tried to defend himself. He spoke of misunderstandings, of protocols, of pressures beyond his control, but the evidence was too precise, too detailed, and his denials crumbled under the weight of every file laid before him. Victoria arrived minutes later, her heels striking the floor with their usual elegance, her scarf tied perfectly, her smile prepared for whatever role she needed to play. But when she turned the corner and saw the investigators, her eyes flickered with a crack of fear. Adrian stepped forward, his posture rigid, his voice quiet but edged like steel. "It's over, Victoria." She blinked, tilting her head with feigned confusion. "Over? Adrian, what are you talking about?" "I came as soon as I heard." He cut her off, holding up Emily's tablet, the screen still glowing with the recording of her hushed deal with Harding. The sound of her own voice spilled into the hall, unmistakable, undeniable. Her hand froze on her scarf. For a moment she tried to laugh, tried to explain, but the poise she wore, like armor, began to shatter. "That's not what it sounds like," she said too quickly, her voice rising, her words tripping over each other. "I was only trying to make sure your mother had the best. You know me. You know I would never." But Adrian's gaze did not waver, and Emily's presence at his side was a silent shield. The mask slipped completely then, her charm twisting into desperation. "You don't understand," she hissed, her eyes narrowing, her composure gone. "You think you're untouchable, but you're not. They promised me you would break. They promised me you would lose everything." The fury in her voice echoed through the corridor, sharp enough to silence the staff who had gathered to watch. Adrian felt no anger now, only a heavy finality. Victoria's elegance was gone, replaced by the raw desperation of someone who knew the game was lost. As investigators moved to take her aside, she pulled once against their grip, her face contorted with rage, but it was useless. Emily stood close, her eyes fixed on Victoria, not with fear, but with the quiet certainty of someone who had seen the truth long before anyone else dared to believe it. The deception had collapsed, and nothing would ever be the same. The ICU had been a place of constant noise for days, the hum of machines and the hurried footsteps of nurses filling every corner. But now the room felt calmer. Margaret lay still beneath the soft glow of the monitors, her breathing steadier than it had been since the surgery. The alarms that had screamed through the night were silent now, replaced by a rhythmic beeping that sounded almost like reassurance. Adrian sat close to the bed, his hand wrapped gently around his mother's for the first time in what felt like forever. Her skin was fragile, her pulse faint but steady, and the simple act of holding her hand stirred something inside him that no amount of power or wealth had ever touched. He thought about how he had been moving through these weeks, throwing money at every problem, summoning specialists, calling in favors, arranging meetings with the best of the best. He had convinced himself that was love, that providing resources was the same as giving care. Yet sitting here now, he realized how blind he had been. His mother had never asked for the most expensive treatments or the newest machines. She had only wanted her son to sit beside her, to remind her that she was not alone. Emily sat quietly on the chair near the window, her sketch pad in her lap, her eyes fixed on the two of them. She did not speak, but her presence filled the room with a different kind of strength. Adrian glanced at her and felt the weight of her courage again, the way she had noticed what he had missed, the way she had insisted on being heard, even when he was too distracted to listen. Without her, his mother might not have survived. Without her, he might never have opened his eyes to the truth about Victoria, about the doctor, about the dangerous game that had been playing out around him while he told himself everything was under control. Margaret's fingers twitched faintly in his hand, and Adrian leaned closer, his voice breaking as he whispered, "I'm here, Mother. I'm not leaving." Her eyelids fluttered, a fragile movement, but enough to send a rush of relief through him. For months, he had distanced himself, burying his tenderness beneath layers of business and responsibility, afraid of appearing weak. Now, weakness no longer mattered. What mattered was this moment, the warmth of her hand in his, the chance to tell her what he had almost lost the chance to say. He stayed there long after the nurses had finished their checks, long after the corridor outside grew quiet. Emily eventually drifted to sleep in her chair, her small head resting against the wall, her sketchpad slipping onto the floor. Adrian looked between them, the woman who had raised him and the girl who had reminded him what it meant to protect family, and felt something shift inside him. Almost losing everything, had stripped away the illusions he had built. Money could save a life for a moment, but love and attention gave it meaning. He knew now he would never make the mistake of looking past the people who mattered most again. The weeks that followed felt like the slow rebuilding of a house after a storm. The chaos of the ICU, the sting of betrayal, and the collapse of deception had left cracks in Adrian's carefully constructed life. But through those cracks, something new began to grow. Victoria was gone, her mask stripped away, her lies exposed under the weight of undeniable evidence. Dr. Arbadger Harding faced charges of corruption and malpractice, his name now a warning whispered through hospital halls. Adrian's company, threatened by rivals who had thought they could break him, stood stronger than ever, fortified not by his wealth alone, but by his resolve and the truth Emily had brought into the light. The day of the adoption hearing came quietly, without the noise of reporters or the weight of boardrooms. The courtroom was small, the judge's voice steady as the papers were signed, but to Adrian it felt larger than any deal he had ever closed. Emily sat beside him in her simple dress, her small hand clutching his, as if she was afraid it might all be taken away at the last moment. When the final stamp came down, when her name officially became Emily Vale, she looked up at him with wide eyes and whispered, "So I'm really staying?" His chest tightened in a way he hadn't expected, and he smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You're not just staying, Emily. You're home." Back at the house, things began to change in ways that had nothing to do with money. The walls, once lined with cold art chosen by decorators, now held Emily's sketches framed with care. Her drawings of the city skyline, of the garden, of Margaret resting with a soft smile, were placed beside family photographs, weaving her into the history of the home. For the first time, the house felt lived in, not just occupied. Margaret, growing stronger each day, often sat in the living room with Emily, telling stories Adrian had nearly forgotten from his childhood. Laughter filled spaces that had long echoed with silence, and warmth spread through corners that had once felt too polished to touch. Adrian found himself slowing down, setting aside time not for meetings but for dinners at the long oak table where Emily shared stories from school. He walked past her room one evening to hear her reading softly to Margaret, her voice gentle and steady, and he realized the girl who had once been overlooked was now the heartbeat of their family. Trust, something he had guarded so fiercely, was no longer something he measured in contracts and deals, but in the way Emily's eyes lit up when he listened to her, in the way his mother's smile returned whenever they were together. For years, Adrian had believed his fortune was his greatest achievement, that numbers and power defined his worth. Now he understood it was this, the fragile but unbreakable bond forged in truth and tested in fire. Emily had saved his mother's life, but more than that, she had saved him, pulling him out of a world of control and into one of trust. The house was no longer just his, it was theirs, a home filled with love, with honesty, and with the certainty that no betrayal could ever shake what they had built together. The morning light spilled across the kitchen, soft and golden, catching on the polished counters and the framed sketches that now hung proudly on the walls. The house, once a silent palace of order and wealth, now carried the hum of life. Adrian sat at the table with a newspaper folded to the side, his coffee cooling slowly in front of him. Margaret was upstairs, resting peacefully after breakfast, her recovery steady and strong, her laughter slowly returning. Emily padded into the room in her socks, her hair tangled from sleep, her sketchpad tucked under her arm like it always was. She moved, with a confidence she hadn't had months ago, no longer the child waiting to be sent away, but the daughter who belonged. Adrian glanced up from the table, watching her climb into the chair across from him, her small legs swinging just above the floor. She opened her sketchpad and began to draw without a word, her brow furrowed in concentration. He smiled at the sight, realizing how much had changed. He had once thought of her as a responsibility, a good deed, something he could manage the way he managed his company. But she had been the one to show him what he could not see, the one to pull him out of his own blindness. The quiet stretched comfortably between them, broken only by the scratch of her pencil. Then Emily looked up, her brown eyes glinting with mischief, and leaned slightly across the table. Her voice dropped to a whisper, not heavy with fear as it had been that first time, but soft and playful. "Don't forget your coffee." Adrian blinked, then laughed, the sound full and unguarded. He reached for the mug he had ignored, shaking his head. "I suppose I'd be lost without you reminding me," he said, his voice warm. Emily grinned, her shy smile growing into something brighter, her cheeks flushing as she bent back over her drawing. It struck him then how powerful that whisper had become. The first time she had spoken to him in that hushed tone, she had carried a secret that had saved his mother's life and exposed the betrayal he had been too blind to see. Her small voice had broken through his walls, forcing him to listen when no one else could. Now, that same whisper carried something lighter, but no less important. A reminder of ordinary mornings, of trust rebuilt, of family found in the most unexpected way. He looked around the kitchen, at her sketches taped proudly to the fridge, at the coffee mugs lined neatly beside the sink, at the faint sound of Margaret humming upstairs. For years, he had filled his life with numbers and deals, convinced that success was measured in the fortune he built. But sitting here, watching Emily's head bent over her drawing, hearing her soft giggle when he exaggerated a sip of coffee, Adrian knew his true wealth had nothing to do with his empire. It was her voice, once overlooked, now the truest sound in his life. And as she leaned across the table again, whispering another reminder about the toast that was beginning to burn, Adrian laughed once more, certain he would never stop listening to her. If this story moved you like it moved us, don't forget to give it a like. And if you want more stories like this one, hit subscribe. We'd love to have you with us.